In the summer of 1943, as Japan struggled to rebuild shattered carrier decks and lost pilots, a single whispered report reached the Imperial Navy's high command. America is launching new carriers, bigger ones, dozens of them. For Japan's admirals, men who once believed the Pacific was theirs, it was the moment the war's tide became a tsunami. Because the Essex-Class wasn't just a ship. It was a verdict. By mid-1942, the vast blue expanse of the Pacific seemed, at first glance, firmly under the shadow of the rising sun. Japanese flags still fluttered over Wake Island, the Solomons, and the far reaches of the Aleutians. Yet beneath this veneer of control, the Imperial Japanese Navy was bleeding. The losses at Coral Sea had been severe. Midway had been catastrophic. 4 of Japan's prideful fleet carriers, Akagi, Koga, Soryu, and Huryu, were gone, and with them, hundreds of veteran pilots whose skill could not be replaced overnight. In Tokyo, the corridors of power were heavy with unease. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, understood better than most the duality of Japan's predicament. Victory in the early months had been Pyrrhic. Each conquest demanded more resources than the nation could sustain. Across the naval headquarters, Admiral Mainichi Koga assumed command of a fleet already stretched thin, charged with the impossible task of defending sprawling territories with diminishing manpower. Meanwhile, Admiral Asami Nagano, once the voice of calculated optimism to Emperor Hirohito, now privately confessed the growing weight of reality. Japan's confidence, so absolute in 1941, was quietly eroding. Japan's shipyards, once humming with controlled precision, now struggled to keep pace. Steel, skilled labor, and dock space were scarce. The new carriers taking shape were slow to emerge, each unfinished hull a reminder that the nation's industrial engine could not match the ambition of its admirals. In contrast, across the Pacific, American shipyards were a living inferno of motion. Welding teams labored under bright arcs of electric light. Riveters beat a relentless rhythm across steel plates. Dry docks filled with vessels whose names, Essex, Yorktown, Enterprise, would soon be etched into the lexicon of naval warfare. Production ran 24 hours a day, a rhythm unbroken by fear or fatigue. Intelligence whispers reached the ears of Japanese planners. Reports hinted at a new American carrier class, larger, faster, and more formidable than anything in service. But confirmation eluded them. Aircraft spotters, codebreakers, and even Tokyo-based naval attachés could only speculate, their updates wrapped in uncertainty. In a rare moment of candor, Nagano remarked to an aide, "If America is building carriers without limit, then this war is already measured in time, not victory." The words, heavy with quiet dread, underscored a shift no sailor at Pearl Harbor could have imagined a year earlier. As night fell over Oahu, a reconnaissance report crackled through Pearl Harbor's communications nets. A long-deck carrier, unlike Yorktown or Enterprise, had been sighted leaving dry dock, moving toward sea trials. For the Japanese Navy, the message was stark and simple. The industrial tide of America had begun to turn, and the Pacific, once a stage for Japanese dominance, was about to become a theater of relentless attrition. Across the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the United States, steel roared and sparks flew as the nation mobilized for a war that had only recently reached its shores. In Newport News, Virginia, the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a new class of warship was taking shape, massive, fast, and designed not just for battle but for dominance. USS Essex, CV-9, was the first of a fleet that would redefine naval warfare. At 27,100 tons displacement, Essex was a floating city of steel. Her flight deck stretched over 862 feet, reinforced to withstand the impact of fully loaded aircraft. Beneath it, hangars housed up to 100 planes, fighters, bombers, torpedo squadrons, ready to strike across hundreds of miles of ocean. Her engines could push her to 33 knots, while armor and compartmentalized repair systems promised survival even under the heaviest bombardment. In comparison to the battered carriers Japan had lost at Midway, she was a leviathan, a statement of industrial power as much as military strategy. Yet the steel and rivets were only part of the story. The true lifeblood of the Essex-Class came from the workers who shaped her. Welders bent over glowing seams, their faces streaked with soot. Rosie the Riveter crews worked shifts that stretched into nights, their hammers and rivets echoing against the hull like a war drum. Engineers slept on factory floors, exhausted but unbowed, knowing each hour brought a ship closer to the Pacific, closer to meeting the carriers that had humiliated Japan a year before. One worker later recalled, "We weren't just building a ship, we were building a wall of steel that America's sons could fight behind." U.S. naval planners had grander visions still. Essex was not an exception. She was the first of a planned 24 ships, either built from scratch or converted from existing hulls. Each new vessel rolled off the lines in rapid succession, a relentless tide of industrial production that Japanese intelligence struggled to comprehend. Intercepts reached Tokyo suggesting the United States was launching a new fleet carrier every few months. To many in the Imperial Navy, it was absurd. One giant vessel at a time, impossible to maintain. In a tense boardroom overlooking the Imperial Navy headquarters, Admiral Koga warned that the American industrial scale was a new kind of weapon, larger than any battleship. Even Admiral Yamamoto, only months from his death over Bougainville, recognized the strategic shift. In a private note, he wrote, "We cannot match a nation that builds mountains out of steel while its sons are still in school." His words captured a growing realization. Japan's early victories were fragile, measured in months rather than years, and the industrial juggernaut across the Pacific would not pause for diplomacy or desire. On 31 December 1942, USS Essex slid into the water, her commissioning ceremony a blend of celebration and quiet menace. The cheers of shipyard workers echoed across the decks, but for those who understood the calculations of war, it was a chilling moment. The Pacific, once a theater dominated by Japanese carriers, was about to face a fleet born not of ambition alone, but of a nation's boundless capacity to produce, replenish, and endure. The giant had been born, and with her, the scales of naval warfare began to tip irrevocably. By late 1943, the Pacific War had begun to assume a shape Japan could neither ignore nor control. The United States, having poured steel, manpower, and ingenuity into a staggering industrial effort, was finally unleashing the fruits of its labor. Essex, CV-9, had been joined by Yorktown, CV-10, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, and a growing roster of carriers that moved with unprecedented speed from shipyard to ocean. These were not incremental reinforcements. They were a declaration of American permanence in the Pacific. The first unmistakable demonstration came at Rabaul, the heavily fortified Japanese stronghold in the Bismarck archipelago. On a single day, carriers of the Essex-Class launched over 200 sorties, striking airfields, ammunition depots, and supply points. The air over the island was thick with the roar of engines, the whine of dive bombers, and the distant thunder of exploding ordnance. Japanese commanders, hardened by months of warfare, could only gape at the scale. One staff officer later recorded simply, "American carriers, there are too many." Thousands of miles away in Tokyo, Admirals Koga, Nagano, and their staff pored over reconnaissance photographs that defied belief. For the first time, intelligence confirmed something previously unimaginable. 3 separate U.S. carrier task groups, each centered on Essex-class vessels, operating in coordination across hundreds of nautical miles. Just a year earlier, the idea of even one such formation had been dismissed as fantasy. Now it was reality, and the implications were stark. A transcript of a staff meeting in Koga's office captures the gravity of the moment. After a long, tense silence, the Admiral spoke. "America is fighting a different war. We are defending islands. They are building an ocean." The statement, simple yet devastating, crystallized the strategic shift. The United States was no longer just replacing losses, it was creating an operational scale that Japan could not match. The Essex-Class had resolved flaws that had cost Japan dearly at Midway. Deck-edge elevators allowed for faster aircraft movement. Armored flight decks offered protection against bombs and kamikaze attacks. Repair cycles that had once grounded carriers for weeks could now be completed in days. Larger air groups, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo squadrons, gave each ship the striking power of an entire Japanese carrier division from 1942. Every photo, every intelligence report, every intercepted signal confirmed that the nature of naval warfare had changed. Japanese naval officers debated furiously. Could even the massive battleships Yamamoto or Musashi contest these new floating airfields? Their guns, though enormous, could not reach hundreds of aircraft spread across the deck of a single Essex-class carrier, let alone an entire task force. The question became academic. The U.S. had shifted from a navy of single, concentrated battleships to an ocean-spanning network of carriers and air power. As the intelligence briefings concluded, one final report arrived. The next wave of Essex-class carriers was already at sea. Japanese analysts estimated up to 10 more would join the Pacific Fleet in 1944. Tokyo fell into silence. For the first time, the weight of American industry and the operational scale it enabled was undeniable. Japan had fought brilliantly in the opening months of the Pacific War, but now the admirals confronted an unassailable truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were being hunted by a force that could rebuild, strike, and overwhelm faster than any victory could be consolidated. The day had arrived when Japan's leaders saw the ocean not as a theater to dominate, but as a vast, moving instrument of American power. And at the center of it, the Essex-class carriers sailed steadily onward, turning the tide of the Pacific one sortie at a time. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become an ocean of steel and flight. The United States Navy, now a fleet of over 15 fast carriers, most of them Essex-class, was preparing to turn ambition into annihilation. Operation Forager, the campaign to seize the Marianas, marked a pivotal convergence of industrial might, strategic planning, and veteran skill. These floating airbases, colossal and efficient, carried squadrons that would strike with precision, endurance, and speed Japan could not match. The skies over the Marianas on June 19, 1944, erupted into what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. From the decks of Essex, Yorktown CV-10, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, and their sister ships, more than 1,500 aircraft roared into action in a single day. F-4U Corsairs, F-6F Hellcats, and S-B-C Heldovers swarmed the horizon, their pilots trained to exploit every advantage. In the air and on the decks, coordination was seamless. Strike groups launched, refueled, repaired, and rearmed at a pace the Japanese could scarcely comprehend. Japanese naval aviation, once feared across the Pacific, was now desperately outmatched. Many of the pilots had months of training, their experience dwarfed by the American veterans they faced. Against the Hellcat, a fighter faster, tougher, and better armed than anything they had flown, they found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outnumbered. Carrier decks emptied as veteran pilots led waves of Hellcats into attacks, only to watch the inexperienced Japanese aviators fall with heartbreaking inevitability. Across the Japanese fleet, commanders could only bear witness to the collapse. Carrier captains watched in silence as their air wings, once the pride of the empire, were destroyed almost entirely in a single afternoon. The loss of Akagi, Koga, Soryu, and Huryu had once seemed tragic. Now, the entire offensive power of Japan's navy was being systematically erased. One admiral would later reflect, "We trained a decade to build an air arm. America destroyed it in a single afternoon." His words captured not just loss, but the stark imbalance of industrial and tactical capacity. The Essex-class, designed for endurance and dominance, executed the role Japan had feared most. their sheer number and operational efficiency rendered Japanese carriers obsolete. Deck-edge elevators allowed rapid relaunches. Armored flight decks kept aircraft and crew alive under relentless counterattacks, and enormous hangars meant replacements could take off as quickly as the losses mounted. Within hours, Japan's ability to project air power across the Pacific had collapsed. By the end of the day, nearly 400 Japanese planes lay destroyed or splashed into the blue waters of the Philippine Sea. Survivors returned to shattered decks, their morale crushed, their mission gone. The Empire's backbone, its carrier-borne air power, had been broken, leaving Japan scrambling to defend a vast, exposed Pacific perimeter with fewer resources, inexperienced pilots, and dwindling hope. And yet, across the ocean, American planners were already looking forward. Reports from shipyards and naval intelligence confirmed even more Essex-Class carriers were being commissioned, destined to enter service in 1945. With these floating fortresses, the next waves of strikes would reach closer to the home islands, ensuring that the Pacific War had only just entered its final, decisive phase. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff faced a stark, unrelenting truth. Reports streamed in from across the Pacific. American carriers were multiplying faster than their analysts could track. "American carriers appear faster than we can count them," one officer noted. Another added in grim resignation, "We no longer fight their ships, only their factories." The words, typed onto intelligence sheets and passed through Tokyo's corridors of power, captured a fundamental reality. The war was no longer measured in tactics, skill, or bravery alone. It was measured in industrial capacity. Admiral Toyota, long a voice of strategic caution, quietly admitted what others feared to speak aloud. "If the Essex is the standard, then our Navy has already expired." His statement was more than hyperbole. The Essex-class carriers, now numbering dozens, embodied a combination of speed, resilience, and striking power that Japan could neither counter nor replace. Each vessel carried squadrons that could launch strikes before Japanese reconnaissance had completed its reports. Deck-edge elevators, armored flight decks, and rapid repair cycles made them virtually impervious to attrition alone, while coordinated task groups projected power across hundreds of miles of ocean simultaneously. Japan's attempts at countermeasures were desperate and increasingly symbolic. Kamikaze strikes were launched with hope but without scale. Night attacks and small flotillas attempted to harass carrier formations, only to be overwhelmed by superior air defense and radar-guided coordination. Refits and replacements arrived too late, too few, and too slowly. The Imperial Navy had once been the pride of the Empire. By 1945, it was a skeleton fighting against a tidal wave of steel, fire, and wings. In the final months, as Tokyo faced its own vulnerability, and the home islands became targets of sustained carrier strikes, surviving Japanese officers found themselves touring Tokyo Bay in August 1945. Anchored before them was a vision of the future they could not have imagined. U.S. carriers lined in triumph, each Essex-class vessel a testament not just to American engineering, but to the relentless capacity of a nation to turn steel into dominance. There was no confrontation, no grand fleet action. Victory had been secured quietly, steadily, and decisively through production, organization, and relentless execution. The narrative of the Pacific War, when examined through this lens, is clear. The Essex-class was more than a ship, it was a statement. The war ended not solely because of bombs, bullets, or courage, but because a nation could outbuild, outreplace, and outmaneuver an empire. In the judgment of historians, the Essex-class carriers were not merely America's answer to Pearl Harbor. They were the vessels that erased Japan's naval future, the ships around which the Pacific War turned, and the standard by which industrialized warfare would forever be measured.